Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, you're on Varietal Literature's YouTube page. Varietal Literature is a group of writers from Vancouver who just enjoy telling stories on Tuesdays. Not this Wednesday, but a lot of Wednesdays we run a book club that feature Vancouver writers, which you can join in on when we're running it, which we will be running one soon, I'm pretty sure. And then on Thursdays, we do kind of like a craft table version of writing, where we write live together silly things. I sort of put together flash fiction. We call that the Varietal Show. But tonight, we read old folktales and fairy tales, weird fiction, things like that. For the last month, we've been doing sort of horror and weird fiction. It did particularly well this year, and I do enjoy it. So, I think I might do once a month a weird fiction week where we look at, because I've also discovered, I'm sure they're not good, but I'm sure they're still fun. I've discovered that there's people that put up old collections. I mean, like 1920s, 30s, 40s collections of, well, they call it weird fiction, but sci-fi and horror and stuff. Volumes, short stories that I doubt anyone has read in like 50 years. So I'm curious about reading some of those. But for the most part, what we do is we read old classic folktales, and that's what we're going to do tonight. We're specifically reading from the Scottish fairy book. The fairy books are a collection of sort of late 19th century, early 20th century collections. There's a bunch of variations of how they got put together, but this one in particular is all Scottish. My ancestors, well, at least half of them anyways, are all Scottish, which of course means nothing because I don't live in Scotland and I have no experiences with being anything but Canadian. But with that said, what it does equip me to do is occasionally bad accents. I see GS is in the chat. Hello, GS. If you want to join in the chat, you're welcome to. We have a live chat. I don't really read from the chat while I'm going through the stories, but I do in between them. And we are going to be looking at two different stories tonight. The first one is the title one, and it's called The Page Boy and the Silver Goblet, which is about a little Scottish boy, page boy specifically, like a one who waits hand and foot. Doing exactly what you're not supposed to do, which is going into a fairy house, which traditionally was barrows. And if you don't know what a barrow is because you're too North American, barrows are basically burial mounds that are pock the land around, England and Scotland and various places like that. And they sort of just look like earthen mounds with some structure to them. And after a while, they definitely got the reputation of containing what are called the good people or the little people, which are fairies and so on. So this little boy is going to do exactly what you're not supposed to do, which is intrude upon the fairies. Now, it should be noted, they don't mind it. That's not the problem. After that, though, we are going to read a story called The Sealcatcher and the Merman, which is a short story. Both these stories are kind of like charming, heartwarming. Well, the first one a little less so, but the second one for sure, kind of charming, heartwarming, happier ending kind of stuff. And I chose them because we're coming out of Halloween, and as much fun as Halloween is, the dreariness can be a bit of a grind. And so I thought we would do something a little more cheerful for our first, because believe me, a lot of the winter tales, even if they're themed around Christmas, get just as dark as any horror story, to be honest. So I thought we'd start off sort of our couple of months here of winter tales, not necessarily Christmas tales, but there's lots of different places that have lots of different stories about frozen lands, and that's what we try to examine November, December, and usually by January we're about done talking about ice, so we try to do other stuff. We'll see how this year goes. So that's a little bit about what we're doing here. We will, of course, not waste any more time. Let me take that sound down just a little bit. right. And we'll get right to the reading here. And let's establish just a little bit of Highlands ambience here. We'll do a little bit of wind. That's a little heavy. Let's go on the light rain. Let me know if that's intruding upon my voice. If you're having trouble hearing me, I can knock down the volume on pretty much anything. But at the moment, we'll have a little bit of rain and a little bit of wind because, of course, the Scottish Highlands are a blustery place. This is called The Page Boy and the Silver Goblet from the Scottish Fairy Book. Author traditional. There was once a little page boy who was in service in a stately castle. He was a very good-natured little fellow and did his duty so willingly and well that everybody liked him. From the great earl, whom he served every day on bended knee, to the fat old butler whose errands he ran. Now the castle stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, and although the walls that at the side were very thick, in them there was a little postern door, which opened to a narrow flight of steps that led down the face of the cliff to the seashore, so that anyone who liked could go down there in the pleasant summer mornings and bathe in the shimmering sea. On the other side of the castle were gardens and pleasure grounds, opening to a long stretch of heather-covered moorland, which at last met a distant range of hills. The little page boy was very fond of going about on this moor when his work was done, for then he could run about as much as he liked, chasing bumblebees and catching butterflies and looking for birds' nests when it was nesting time. And the old butler was very pleased that he should do so, for he knew that it was good for a healthy little lad to have plenty of fun in the open air. But before the boy went out, the old man always gave one warning. "Now, mind my lord's words, laddie, and keep far away from the ferry now. The little folk are not to trust." This "no," which he spoke of, was a little green hillock, which stood on the moor not 20 yards from the garden gate. Folks said that it was the abode of fairies, who would punish any rash mortal who came too near to them. And because of this, the country people would walk a good half-mile out of their way, even in broad daylight, rather than run the risk of going too near the ferry mill, and bringing down the little folks' displeasure upon them. And at night, they would hardly cross the moor at all. For everyone knows that fairies come abroad in the darkness, and the door of their dwelling stands open, so that any luckless mortal who does not take care may find himself inside. Now, the little page boy was an adventurous wight, and instead of being frightened of the fairies, he was very anxious to see them and to visit their abode, just to find out what it was like. So one night, when everyone was asleep, he crept out of the castle by the little postern door, and stole down the stone steps and along the seashore, and up onto the moor, and went straight to the ferry mill. To his delight, he found that what everyone said was true. The top of the knowe was tipped up, in the opening that was thus made, rays of light came streaming out. His heart was beating fast with excitement, but gathering his courage, he stooped down and slipped inside the knowe. To his delight, he found Oh, sorry. His heart came beating fast with excitement, but gathering his courage, he stooped down and slipped inside the gnome. He found himself in a large room lit by numberless tiny candles. And there, seated round a polished table, were scores of the tiny folk. Fairies and elves and gnomes, dressed in green and yellow and pink, blue and lilac and scarlet, in all the colors, in fact, that you can think of. He stood in a dark corner watching the busy scene in wonder, thinking how strange it was that there would be such a number of these tiny beings living their own little lives, all unknown to man, at such a little distance from them, when suddenly someone, he could not tell who it was, gave an order. "Fetch the cup!" cried the owner of the unknown voice, and instantly 2 little fairy pages, dressed all in scarlet livery, darted from the table to a tiny cupboard in the rock, and returned staggering under the weight of the most beautiful silver cup, richly embossed and lined with gold. He placed it in the middle of the table, and amid clapping hands and shouts of joy, all the fairies began to drink out of it in turn. And the page could see from where he stood that no one poured wine into it, and yet it was still always full, and that the wine that was in it was not always the same kind, but that each fairy, when he grasped its stem, wished for the wine that he loved best. And lo, in a moment the cup was full of it. "'Twould be a fine thing if I could take that cup home with me." Oh, that's the boy. Sorry. Let's try that one again. "'Twould be a fine thing if I could take that cup home with me," thought the page. "No one will believe me that I've been here except I have something to show for it." So he bided his time and watched. Presently the fairies noticed him, and instead of being angry at his boldness in entering their abode, as he expected that they would be, they seemed very pleased to see him, and invited him to a seat at the table. But by and by they grew rude and insolent, and jeered at him for being content to serve mere mortals, telling him that they saw everything that went on at the castle, and making fun of the old butler, whom the page loved with all his heart. And they laughed at the food he ate, saying that it was only fit for animals. And when any fresh dainty was set on the table by the scarlet-clad pages, they would push the dish across to him, saying, "Taste it, for you will not have the chance of tasting such things at the castle." At last he could not stand their teasing remarks no longer. He could stand there. Besides, he knew that if he wanted to secure the cup, he must lose no time in doing so. So he suddenly stood up, grasped the stem of it tightly in his hand, and said, "I'll drink to all you in water," he cried, and instantly the ruby wine was turned to clear, cold water. And there's some beautiful art of him, having a good laugh there. He raised the cup to his lips, but he did not drink from it. With a sudden jerk, he threw the water over the candles, and instantly the room was in darkness. Then, clasping the precious cup tightly in his arms, he sprang to the opening of the knowe, through which he could see the stars glimmering clearly. He was just in time, for it fell with a crash behind him, and as soon as he was speeding along the wet, dew-spangled moor, with the whole troop of fairies at his heels, they were wild with rage, and from the shrill shouts of fury they uttered, the page knew well that, if they overtook him, he need expect no mercy at their hands, and his heart began to sink, for fleet of foot though he was no match for the fairy folk, who gained on him steadily. All seemed lost, when a mysterious voice sounded out of the darkness. "If thou wouldst gain the castle door, keep to the black stones on the shore." It was the voice of some poor mortal who, for some reason or other, had been taken prisoner by the fairies, who were really very malicious little folk, and who did not want a like fate to befall the adventurous page boy. But the little fellow did not know this. He had once heard that if anyone walked on the wet sands where the waves had come over them, the fairies could not touch him. And this mysterious sentence brought the saying into his mind. So he turned from the castle and dashed panting down to the shore. His feet sank in the dry sand and his breath came in little gasps. He felt as if he must give up the struggle, but he persevered. And at last, just as the foremost fairies were about to lay hands on him, he jumped across the watermark onto the firm, wet sands, from which the waves had just receded. And then he knew that he was safe. For the little folk could step no further, but stood on the dry stand uttering cries of rage and disappointment, while the triumphant page boy ran safely along the shore, his precious cup in his hands. He climbed lightly up the steps in the rock and disappeared through the postern, and for many years after, long after the little page boy had grown up and become a stately butler who trained other little page boys to follow in his footsteps, the beautiful cup remained in the castle as a witness of his adventure. Gia says, "Oh, I love that print. Now that's line work at its finest." Let's look at it again. I see your Cthulhu hanging out. Yes, I had him out for, if you guys didn't see it, on Monday, because it was Halloween, I did a special reading. It was pre-recorded, had some video and stuff edited in to give it a little more ambiance, of a monster in a forest. It's not hard to guess which kind, but I'll leave that to the story. And yeah, I put it up there because I remembered I had it, and it's one of my favorite things I have of Cthulhu. And then I was going to take it down because we're into winter now, and I was like, nah, Cthulhu is now and forever. All right. Well, let me get a drink of water and we will read our second story. Okay. Our second story also comes from the Scottish fairy book. It's called The Sealcatcher and the Merman. And though it has a bit of a grim start, it doesn't remain in that tone. and is actually a fairly sweet story. Once upon a time, there was a man who lived not very far from John O'Groat's house, which, as everyone knows, is in the very north of Scotland. He lived in a little cottage by the seashore and made his living by catching seals and selling their fur, which is very valuable. He earned a good deal of money in this way, for these creatures used to come out of the sea in large numbers and lie on the rocks near his house, basking in the sunshine, so that it was not difficult to creep up behind them and kill them. Some of these seals were larger than others, and the country people used to call them Roan, and desperate that they were, and whisper that they were not seals at all, but mermen and merwomen. Mermaids. Come on. Keep up. Who came from a country of their own, far down under the ocean, who assumed this strange disguise in order that they might pass through the water and come up to breathe the air of this earth of ours. But the Sealcatcher only laughed at them and said that those seals were most worth killing, for their skins were so big that he got an extra price for them. Now it chanced one day, when he was pursuing his calling, that he stabbed a seal with his hunting knife. Whether the stroke had been sure enough or not, I cannot say, but with a loud cry of pain, the creature slipped off the rock into the sea and disappeared under the water. Carrying the knife along with him, unfortunately for him. The Sealcatcher, much annoyed at his clumsiness, also at the loss of his knife, went home to dinner in a very downcast frame of mind, and on his way he met a horseman who was so tall and so strange-looking and who rode on such a gigantic horse that he stopped and looked at him in astonishment, wondering who he was and from what country he came. The stranger stopped also and asked him for his trade, and on hearing that he was a seal catcher, he immediately ordered a great number of seal skins. Well, the seal catcher was delighted, and for such an order meant a large sum of money to him. But his face fell when the horseman added that it was absolutely necessary that the skins should be delivered that evening. "I cannot do that," he said in a disappointed voice, "for the seals will not come back to the rocks again until tomorrow morning." "I can take you to a place where there are any number of seals," answered the stranger, "if you will mount up behind me on my horse and come with me." The seal catcher agreed to this and climbed up behind the rider, who shook his bridle rein, and off the great horse galloped at such a pace that he had much ado to keep his seat. And on they went, flying like the wind, until at last they came down to the edge of a huge precipice. The face of which went sheer down to the sea, and here the mysterious horseman pulled up his steed with a jerk. "Get off now," he said shortly. Well, the seal catcher did as he was bid, and when he found himself safe on the ground, he peeped cautiously over the edge of the cliff to see if there were any seals lying on the rocks below. To his astonishment, he saw no rocks, only the blue sea, which came right up to the foot of the cliff. "What are the seals you just spoke of?" he asked anxiously, wishing that he'd never set out on such a rash adventure. "You will see presently," answered the stranger who was attending to his horse's bridle. The Sealcatcher was now thoroughly frightened, for he felt sure that evil was about to befall him. And in such a lonely place, he knew that it would be useless to cry out for help. And it seemed as if his fears would prove only too true, for the next moment, the stranger's hand was laid upon his shoulder, and he felt himself being hurled bodily over the cliff, and then he fell into the sea with a splash. He thought that his last hour had come, and he wondered how many could work such a deed of wrong upon an innocent man. But to his astonishment, he found that some change must have passed over him, for instead of being choked by water, he could breathe quite easily. And he and his companions, who were still close at side, seemed to be sinking as quickly. Through the sea as if they had flown through the air. Down and down they went. Nobody knows how far. Till at last they came to a huge arched door which appeared to be made of pink coral, studded over with cockle shells. It opened of its own accord, and when they entered, they found themselves in a huge hall, the walls of which were formed of mother of pearl, the floor of which was of sea sand, smooth, firm, and yellow. The hall was crowded with occupants, but they were seals, not men. And when the Sealcatcher turned to his companion to ask what it all meant, he was aghast to find that he too had assumed the form of a seal. He was still more aghast when he caught sight of himself in a large mirror that hung on the wall, and saw that he no longer bore the likeness of a man, but was transformed to a nice, hairy brown seal. "Oh, woe to me," he said, "for no fault of mine. Only this artful stranger hath laid some baneful charm upon me. In his awful guise will I remain for the rest of my life." At first, none of the huge creatures spoke to him. For some reason or other, they seemed to be very sad, and moved gently about the hall, talking quietly and mournfully to one another, or lay sadly upon the sandy floor, wiping big tears from their eyes with their soft, furry fins. But presently they began to notice him, and to whisper to one another, and presently his guide moved away from him and disappeared through a door at the end of the hall. And when he returned, he held a huge knife in his hand. "Didst thou ever see this before?" he asked, holding it out to the unfortunate Sealcatcher, who, to his horror, recognized his own hunting knife with which he had struck the seal in the morning, and which had been carried off by the wounded animal. At the sight of it, he fell upon his face and begged for mercy, for he at once came to the conclusion that the inhabitants of the cavern, enraged at the harm which he had been wrought upon their comrade, had in some magic way contrived to capture him and bring him down to their subterranean abode in order to wreak their vengeance upon him by killing him. But instead of doing so, they crowded around him, rubbing their soft noses against his fur to show their sympathy, and implored him not to put himself about, for no harm would befall him. and they would love him all their lives long if he would only do what they asked him. "Tell me what it is," said the Sealcatcher, "and I will do it, if it lies within my power." "Follow me," answered his guide, and he led the way to the door through which he had disappeared when he went to seek the knife. The Sealcatcher followed him, and there, in a smaller room, he found a great brown seal lying on a bed of pale pink seaweed, with a gaping wound in his side. "That is my father," said his guide, "whom thou wounded this morning, thinking that he was one of the common seals who live in the sea, and instead of a mermaid who hath speech and understanding as you mortals have. I brought thee hither to bind up his wounds, for no other hand than thine can heal him." "I have no skill in the art of healing," said the Sealcatcher, astonished at the forbearance of these strange creatures whom he'd so unwittingly wronged. "But I will bind up the wound to the best of my power, and I'm only sorry that it was my hands that caused it." He went over to the bed, and stooping over the wounded merman, washed and dressed the hurt as well as he could, and the touch of his hands appeared to work like magic. For no sooner had he finished than the wound seemed to deaden and die, leaving only the scar, and the old seal sprang up as well as ever. Then there was great rejoicing through the whole palace of the seals. They laughed and they talked and they embraced each other in their own strange way, crowding round their comrade and rubbing their noses against him, as if to show how delighted they were at his recovery. But all this while the Sealcatcher stood alone in a corner, with his mind filled with dark thoughts, for although he saw now that they had no intentions of killing him, he did not relish the prospect of spending the rest of his life in the guise of a seal, fathoms deep under the ocean. But presently, to his great joy, his guide approached him and said, "Now, you are at liberty to return home to your wife and children. I will take you to them, but on only one condition." "And what is that?" asked the Sealcatcher eagerly, overjoyed at the prospect of being restored safely to the upper world and to his family. "That you will take a solemn oath never to wound a seal again." "That will I do right gladly," he replied, for although the promise meant giving up his means of livelihood, he felt that if only he regained his proper shape, he could always turn his hand to something else. So he took the required oath with all due solemnity, holding up his fin as he swore, and all the other seals crowded around him as witnesses. And a sigh of relief went through the halls when the words were spoken, for he was the most noted Sealcatcher in the north. Then he bade the strange company farewell, and accompanied by his guide, passed once more through the outer doors of coral, and up, and up, and up, through the shadowy green water, until it began to grow lighter and lighter, and at last they emerged into the sunshine of the earth. Then with one spring, they reached the top of the cliff, where the great black horse was waiting for them, quietly nibbling the green turf. And when they left the water, their strange disguise dropped from them, and they were now, as they had been before, a plain Sealcatcher and a tall, well-dressed gentleman in riding clothes. "Get up behind me," said the latter, as he swung himself into his saddle. The Sealcatcher did as he was bid, taking tight hold of his companion's coat, for he remembered how he'd nearly fallen off on his previous journey. And then it all happened as before. The bridle was shaken, the horse galloped off, and it was not long before the Sealcatcher found himself standing in safety before his own garden gate. He held out a hand to say goodbye, but as he did, the stranger pulled out a huge bag of gold and placed it in it. "Thou hast done thy part of the bargain. We must do ours," he said. "Men shall never say that we took away an honest man's work without making reparation for it. And here is what will keep thee in comfort to thy life's end." And then he vanished. And when the astonished Sealcatcher carried the bag into his cottage, he turned the gold out on the table, and he found what the stranger had said was true, and that he would be a rich man for the remainder of his days. The end. GS says, this is a very touching story about forgiveness and redemption. Yeah, here's something I didn't expect when I was reading through some of the Scottish tales, because I wanted to do some more Scottish tales. They're really sincere and sweethearted, because that's not really the reputation Scots have. But then I guess who defines that reputation, right? Yeah, anyways, it just wasn't what I expected for whatever culmination of reasons. We may yet read a few more Scottish folk tales and fairy tales this month. It's a little bit of a limbo time right now for this show, because basically it goes Halloween, and then there's a couple of weeks here where it's like, it's too early to be doing Christmas stuff, but it's kind of too like you don't want to, Halloween stuff doesn't perform after Halloween at all. So, it's a matter of just figuring out what to do with that time. We'll see what kind of things catch my fancy. If you are, a new viewer to this channel or anything like that, let me know in the comments what sort of things you're interested in hearing read. Just be aware, I can't read things that are still copyrighted, or at least are being actively monitored and copyrighted. Like, technically nothing that's still copyrighted, but there is stuff that is 5 years away from being out of copyright and no one has read in 50 that you could probably get away with. If there's things that you think about that guy could do a good job with that tale, let me know, because I'm always interested in looking for new little pockets of tales. And of course, Thursday is the Varietal Show. We're going to be doing something chill because it was a very busy month last month for me, and I want to do something chill. So I think we'll probably be doing what I call the Bob Ross thing, which I probably can't keep calling the Bob Ross thing, which is basically like Bob Ross, where we just sort of write little vignettes together. It's not even particularly about stories. It's about descriptive prose. We use usually pictures, and I sort of have an idea about how prose, a little piece of tips about how prose works, especially descriptive prose. And then by we all, I mean myself and people in the chat, sort of write little blurbs or little descriptions of stock photos and things like that. And we share them together, and I read them out loud. And I don't know, again, it's sort of like the craft table of writing. It's warm, it's charming, it's fun. If you enjoy writing, come back Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, 9:30 p.m. Eastern for the Varietal Show. And if you are new to this channel, maybe consider subscribing. That would be really cool. At the very least, if you enjoyed this video, consider liking it. And if you really liked it, the thing that helps the most is to go and tell other people about it. And of course, if you really enjoyed it and you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link to do that down below, but you don't have to do that. I just enjoy the company. Well, thank you very much for keeping me company, GS, and everybody out there in the land who's watching it in video on demand or quietly in the background. I always appreciate it. These have been Scottish Folktales. I've been Rory. This has been Fireside Fairy Tales. I'll keep the fire going. You have a good sleep.